The email arrived at 4:47 p.m. on a Thursday. Subject line: Organizational restructuring. Effective immediately. I was sitting in the third-floor break room at Callaway and Mercer, eating a granola bar I'd been trying to finish for 3 hours because the day had been that kind of day, and I read the words, "We're pleased to announce that Ethan Langford has been appointed Senior Director of Supply Chain Intelligence." And I set the granola bar down on the table very carefully. The way you set things down when your hands have decided to shake, and your brain hasn't authorized it yet. Ethan Langford. The intern I'd trained. The one who, 6 months ago, couldn't tell the difference between a purchase order and a packing slip. Senior Director. My Senior Director. Reporting line, me to him. Effective immediately. I should start at the beginning. My name is Vivian Cho. I'm 41 years old. For 13 years, I was the Director of Supply Chain Operations at Callaway and Mercer, a mid-size industrial distribution company headquartered in Columbus, Ohio, with regional warehouses in Louisville, Indianapolis, and Pittsburgh. We moved $220 million in product annually. Heavy machinery components, industrial fasteners, hydraulic systems, to 340 active accounts across the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic. Supply chain in industrial distribution isn't glamorous. It's not the kind of work that gets profiled in business magazines or discussed at cocktail parties. It's the kind of work that, when done correctly, is invisible, and when done incorrectly, costs people their jobs. I did it correctly. For 13 years. Here's what correctly looked like in numbers, because numbers don't have opinions. I designed and implemented the Ironclad Fulfillment System in 2016. A proprietary order routing protocol that reduced average delivery time from 6.2 days to 2.8 days across all 4 facilities. Before Ironclad, our on-time delivery rate was 81%. After Ironclad, it was 97.3%. That number held for 7 consecutive years. I maintained it the way you maintain anything that matters. With daily attention, quarterly audits, and the quiet understanding that the moment you stop watching, the number starts to slip. I built the Nexus vendor management platform in 2019, which consolidated our relationships with 187 suppliers into a single scoring and communication system. Nexus tracked pricing trends, lead time reliability, quality rejection rates, and contract compliance across every vendor. Before Nexus, we lost an average of $1.4 million annually to supplier-related disruptions, late shipments, quality failures, pricing discrepancies that nobody caught until the invoice hit accounting. After Nexus, that number dropped to $210,000. I saved this company $1.2 million a year with a system I built on evenings and weekends because the IT department told me they didn't have bandwidth, and I decided that wasn't my problem. I also created the Sentinel Inventory Forecasting Model, a demand prediction tool that used 3 years of historical order data, seasonal adjustment curves, and client-specific purchasing patterns to anticipate stock needs 90 days out. Sentinel reduced our dead stock write-offs by 62% in its first year and freed up $3.1 million in working capital that had been sitting in warehouses as inventory nobody needed. Our CFO, Diane Okafor, called Sentinel the single most impactful operational tool this company has deployed in a decade. She said this in a quarterly review meeting, in front of the entire leadership team. I wrote it down, not because I needed the validation, though I won't pretend it didn't matter, but because I'd learned by then that when someone says something true about your work in a room full of people, you record it because the room will forget and you shouldn't. The personal cost of those systems was the standard fare. I hadn't taken a full weekend off in 4 years. I'd missed my son Caleb's 8th birthday party. The real one, the one with his friends, not the quiet family dinner we did the next day as a substitute that he accepted with the gracious disappointment of a child who has learned not to expect the thing he actually wants. I'd missed my mother's 70th birthday dinner in Cleveland because a warehouse management system migration in Louisville went sideways at 3 p.m. on a Friday, and I spent the next 14 hours on the phone with our WMS vendor, eating vending machine pretzels and watching the sunset and then rise through the window of a conference room that smelled like dry erase markers and stale coffee. My husband, James, had stopped asking, "Will you be home for dinner?" and started asking, "Should I save you a plate?" Which is the same question wearing different clothes, but the clothes tell you everything about the trajectory of the conversation. I was the person who kept Callaway and Mercer's supply chain running. Not theoretically, not collaboratively, specifically personally, and with a level of institutional knowledge that existed nowhere else in the organization. Not in a manual, not in a shared drive, not in anyone else's head. I was the single point of failure, which is a terrible thing to be in systems engineering and an even worse thing to be in a company that doesn't understand what it has until it's gone. Ethan Langford arrived in March 2023 as a strategic operations intern. He was 27. He had an MBA from a program in North Carolina that I looked up once, and that appeared to specialize in producing graduates with strong opinions about disruption and weak opinions about everything else. He was also, and this is the part that matters, the part that explains everything that follows, the nephew of Richard Mercer. Richard Mercer, as in the Mercer in Callaway and Mercer, co-founder, chairman of the board, the man whose portrait hung in the lobby next to the mission statement, both of which had been there so long that nobody looked at either one anymore. Ethan was tall, affable, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes from never having been in a room where he was the least important person. He wore slim-fit chinos and quarter-zip pullovers that probably cost more than my daily rate, and he had a habit of saying "totally" at the beginning of sentences where it served no grammatical or semantic purpose. Totally, I think we should deep dive the logistics matrix. Totally, let's ideate on the vendor optimization space. He once described our warehouse layout as the physical instantiation of our operational DNA, which is a sentence I've thought about at least once a week since he said it, not because it was insightful but because it was so aggressively meaningless that it achieved a kind of linguistic antimatter, words that, upon contact with actual thought, annihilated both. I was asked to train him. Not asked exactly. Informed. My boss at the time, Neil Callaway, CEO, the other half of the founding equation, called me into his office on March 8th and said, "Vivian, Ethan's going to shadow you for a few months. Richard wants him to get a ground-level understanding of operations before we figure out his permanent role. Just show him the ropes." The ropes turned out to be everything. Every system, every vendor relationship, every client-specific protocol, every workaround I'd built over 13 years to compensate for the company's refusal to invest in proper infrastructure. I showed Ethan the ironclad routing logic. I walked him through Nexus vendor by vendor. I explained Sentinel's forecasting algorithms in a 4-hour session during which he nodded continuously and took notes that I later saw consisted primarily of the words data-driven and scalable written in various configurations with arrows between them. I trained him for 6 months. I gave him everything. Not because I wanted to, but because I was asked to, and because I believed naively, stupidly, with a particular blindness of someone who has confused loyalty with safety, that the company would recognize the difference between the person who built the systems and the person who'd been shown where the buttons were. 6 months. I taught him how to read a carrier performance report. I taught him how to negotiate a freight rate without alienating the carrier, which is an art, not a science, and which Ethan approached with the subtlety of someone who'd learned negotiation from a podcast. I taught him how to handle the 2 a.m. call from the Louisville warehouse when a shipment is misrouted and the client is Pratt Industrial, our largest account at $18.6 million annually, and Pratt's logistics director, a woman named Sandra Yee who has been doing this for 25 years and does not tolerate excuses, is already on the other line asking questions you'd better have answers to. I taught him everything. And on a Thursday in September, sitting in the break room with a granola bar I couldn't finish, I learned what that teaching had purchased me. The email was from Neil Callaway. It was 340 words long. It described Ethan's appointment as a reflection of the company's commitment to next-generation leadership and operational innovation. It described my new reporting structure, me reporting to Ethan, as an opportunity to leverage Vivian's deep institutional expertise in support of Ethan's strategic vision. It mentioned Ethan's salary nowhere because company emails don't mention salaries, but Diane Okafor told me 2 days later, in the quiet, careful voice of someone delivering information they know will cause damage, $195,000. Ethan's salary was $195,000. Mine was $112,000. I'd been at $112,000 for 3 years because my last 2 raise requests had been deferred with the phrase, "We'll revisit this in Q3, and Q3 had come and gone twice without revisitation. $195,000. For a man who, 4 months ago, had asked me what phobie stood for. I sat in the break room for 7 minutes after reading the email. I know it was 7 minutes because I watched the clock on the microwave, the way you watch something fixed when everything else is moving. The fluorescent light above the vending machine buzzed at a frequency I'd never noticed before. Or maybe I'd always noticed and just never had the silence to hear it. My phone vibrated. A text from Raj Patel, our warehouse operations manager in Louisville, a man I'd worked with for 9 years and who communicated primarily through understatement. Saw the email. This is wrong. Another text from Diane. Call me when you can. Not on company phone. Another from a number I didn't recognize immediately, but that turned out to be Sandra Yee at Pratt Industrial, who had somehow already heard. Vivian, what the hell is happening over there? And then one from Ethan. From Ethan. Sent at 5:02 p.m., 15 minutes after the announcement. Hey Vivian. Super excited to partner with you in this new capacity. Let's sync first thing Monday to align on the operational roadmap. I've got some big ideas for optimizing the fulfillment throughput. Rocket. A rocket ship emoji. He sent me a rocket ship emoji. I put my phone face down on the table. I finished the granola bar. It tasted like nothing, which was fine because I wasn't eating it for the taste. I was eating it because it was a small, completable action in a moment when everything else felt like it had been picked up and set down slightly to the left of where it belonged. Recognizable but wrong, the way a room looks after someone has moved the furniture 2 inches in every direction. I drove home. James had saved me a plate. Caleb was already in bed. I sat at the kitchen table and I opened my laptop and I did not cry because crying is what you do when something surprises you. And this, if I was honest, if I was truly ruthlessly honest, had not surprised me. It had confirmed something I'd been refusing to see for years. The way you refuse to see a crack in a foundation because acknowledging it means acknowledging that the whole structure is compromised. I opened a new document. I titled it Transition Notes. And then I deleted that title and replaced it with something more accurate. I titled it Exit Strategy. If this story sounds familiar, if you've ever poured years into a company only to watch someone with the right last name leapfrog everything you built, make sure to like and subscribe. I share workplace strategy and corporate analysis every week that might change how you navigate your career. Because what I did over the next 3 months didn't just change my situation, changed the entire company. And it started with a single realization that I should have had years ago. The systems I built were worth more than the title they'd taken from me. And I was the only person who knew how they actually worked. What Ethan Langford didn't know, what nobody at Callaway and Mercer knew, because I had never seen a reason to tell them, was that I had been preparing for something like this since 2019. Not for Ethan specifically. I didn't have the gift of prophecy. And I couldn't have predicted that Richard Mercer's nephew would arrive with an MBA and a rocket ship emoji and dismantle my career in 6 months. But I had been in industrial distribution for 18 years by then, and I had watched enough competent people get replaced by convenient ones to understand a basic truth about corporate architecture. If you are the person who builds the systems, you need to be the person who controls the documentation because the moment someone else controls the documentation, you become optional. And optional people get optimized out of the org chart by men in quarter-zip pullovers who use the word scalable as verb. So I built layers. The ironclad fulfillment system, the one that kept our on-time delivery at 97.3% for 7 years, ran on a routing logic that I had designed in 3 tiers. Tier 1 was the surface layer, the interface that warehouse managers use daily, the dashboards, the automated alerts, the carrier assignment protocols. This layer was documented. It lived on the company's shared drive in a folder called Ironclad Operations Manual, 140 pages, last updated August 2023. Anyone with access could read it. Ethan had read it, or at least had opened the file because I could see the access log. Tier 2 was the calibration layer. This was the set of seasonal adjustment parameters, carrier-specific routing exceptions, and client priority weightings that I updated quarterly based on performance data from Nexus and forecasting outputs from Sentinel. These adjustments were not automated. They required judgment, the kind of judgment that comes from knowing that Pratt Industrial's Louisville facility has a loading dock that can't accommodate 53-foot trailers on Tuesdays and Thursdays because of a municipal parking ordinance that went into effect in 2017, or that our carrier contract with Great Lakes Freight includes a fuel surcharge cap that resets every April 1st and needs to be manually reconciled against actual diesel index pricing, or that 3 of our top 10 clients have informal but ironclad preferences about delivery windows that exist nowhere in their contracts but everywhere in their expectations. Tier 2 was documented in my personal files, on my personal laptop, in a folder I updated every quarter and backed up to an encrypted external drive that lived in the bottom drawer of my desk at home, next to a box of Caleb's old drawings and a flashlight that needed batteries. Tier 3 was the vendor relationship layer. This wasn't a system. It wasn't software. It was 13 years of phone calls, site visits, problem solving, and the slow accumulation of trust that happens when you consistently do what you say you'll do. I knew the direct cell numbers of 43 vendor contacts. I knew which suppliers would expedite a shipment as a favor, and which ones required a formal change order. I knew that our second largest fastener supplier, a family-owned operation in Akron called Reinhardt Precision, had nearly dropped us in 2020 over a payment dispute that I resolved personally, over 2 phone calls and a lunch in Akron that cost $34 and saved the company a $6.2 million annual supply relationship. That knowledge, the relational architecture of 187 vendor partnerships, lived in one place: my head. I hadn't built these layers as a trap. I want to be clear about that because the distinction matters. I had asked repeatedly for resources to formalize the calibration protocols. In 2020, I submitted a proposal to Neil Calloway requesting a dedicated supply chain documentation analyst, a $65,000 position that would have systematized everything in Tier 2 and created redundancy for Tier 3. Neil said it was a good idea in principle, but that the budget was tight. The budget was always tight for infrastructure. It was never tight for the executive retreat in Hilton Head or the office renovation that gave Neil a standing desk he used for 3 weeks before going back to sitting. I asked again in 2021. Deferred. Again in 2022. Deferred. By 2023, I had stopped asking, not because I'd accepted the answer, but because I'd understood what the answer meant. They didn't want redundancy. They wanted me. Specifically, permanently. And without the institutional safeguards that would have protected them if I ever left. They had chosen to make me indispensable and then to treat me as though I were disposable, which is a combination that only works until it doesn't. So when I sat at my kitchen table on that Thursday night in September and typed exit strategy at the top of a blank document, I wasn't starting from scratch. I was activating something that had been in place for 4 years. I knew exactly what would happen when I left. Not because I'd planned sabotage, I hadn't and I wouldn't, but because I understood the systems I'd built the way an architect understands a building. I knew which walls were load-bearing. The following Monday, I walked into Ethan Langford's office at 8:30 a.m. His office. The office that had been mine for 9 years before Neil reassigned it as part of the leadership transition. Ethan had added a small succulent to the windowsill and a whiteboard on which he'd written Q4 priorities in blue marker, followed by 3 bullet points: streamline fulfillment cadence, optimize vendor ecosystem, and leverage data-driven insights for scalable growth. 3 bullet points that said absolutely nothing, arranged with the confidence of someone who believed that writing things on a whiteboard was the same as doing them. "Ethan," I said, "I'm giving my 2 weeks' notice." He looked up from his laptop. He was wearing a Patagonia vest over a button-down, the unofficial uniform of men who want to signal that they're serious but approachable, and his expression went through 3 phases in about 2 seconds. Surprise, confusion, and then a careful rearrangement into something he probably thought looked like composed leadership, but actually looked like a man trying to remember where he'd parked. "Vivian, wow. Babe, can we talk about this? I feel like there's a lot of runway here for us to co-architect a path forward that." "I've accepted another position," I said. This was true. I'd been in conversations with a logistics consulting firm in Chicago called Meridian Partners since July. Quiet conversations, initiated by their managing director, a woman named Catherine Hale, who had heard me speak at an Apex conference in 2021 and had been trying to recruit me ever since. The offer was $168,000 base with a $30,000 signing bonus and equity participation after 2 years. I'd signed the letter of intent the previous Friday, 12 hours after reading Neil's email about Ethan's promotion. The timing was not coincidental. The timing was the point. Another position, Ethan repeated. Okay. I mean, totally that's your prerogative, but I think we should loop in Neil and maybe HR to discuss a counteroffer, because you're a key stakeholder in our operational. I'm not interested in a counteroffer. Vivian. My last day will be October 6th. I'll prepare transition documentation for the systems I manage. Is there anything else? There wasn't. He said, let's circle back on this as I left, which is what people say when they don't know what to say but feel that silence would be an admission of inadequacy. I went back to my desk. My new desk, the one in the open floor plan, the one without a door, and I began writing the transition documentation I'd promised. It was thorough. It was professional. It covered Tier 1 of every system I'd built, in meticulous detail, with screenshots and process flows and step-by-step instructions that any competent operations professional could follow. Covered Tier 1. Only Tier 1. I want to be precise about this because precision matters and because the difference between what I did and what I'm sometimes accused of doing is the difference between withholding and simply not volunteering. The transition documentation I provided was complete and accurate for every process that was formally documented on company systems. I did not delete anything. I did not sabotage anything. I did not change any passwords or remove any files from company servers. What I did was leave and take with me the things that had always been mine. My knowledge, my relationships, and the contents of my personal laptop, which had never been company property and which contained the Tier 2 calibration data that the company had declined, for times, to formalize into institutional documentation. I left on October 6th. Diane Okafor took me to lunch at a Thai place on High Street that we'd been going to for years. She ordered the Panang curry. I ordered the pad CEW. She said, "How long do you give it before everything falls apart?" I said, "Define everything." She said, "Ironclad." I said, 6 weeks. She said, "I'll take the under." Diane was right to take the under. 11 days after my departure, October 17th, a Tuesday, I received a phone call from Raj Patel in Louisville. Raj, who had texted me, "This is wrong," on the day of Ethan's promotion, and who had spent the subsequent weeks watching the operational infrastructure I'd built begin to drift in the way that complex systems drift when the person who calibrates them is no longer calibrating them. Slowly at first, then all at once. "Vivian," he said, "we have a problem." "You have a problem," I corrected gently. "I work at Meridian Partners now." "Right. The Ironclad routing is sending half the Indianapolis orders through the Louisville hub instead of direct shipping from Pittsburgh. It's been doing it for 3 days. Nobody caught it until this morning because the dashboards look normal. The orders are showing as fulfilled, but the delivery times are running 2.1 days over target, and we've got 74 shipments sitting in Louisville that shouldn't be here." I knew exactly what had happened. The Q4 carrier rebalancing. The Tier 2 calibration I performed every October 1st to account for seasonal volume shifts and carrier contract renewals hadn't been done. Without it, Ironclad's routing algorithm was still operating on Q3 parameters, which allocated 35% of Indianapolis-bound freight through Louisville as a cost optimization during the summer months when Great Lakes Freight offered a seasonal discount. That discount ended September 30th. Without the recalibration, the system was routing shipments through a hub that was no longer cost-effective, adding transit time and racking up carrier surcharges that nobody was monitoring because nobody knew they needed to be monitored. "Have you told Ethan?" Yes. Ethan told me to recalibrate the fulfillment matrix, which I think means he wants me to fix it but doesn't know how to say that in words that correspond to actual operations. "What did you say?" "I said I'd look into it. Then I called you. Raj, I can't fix this for you. I don't work there anymore." "I know. I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm asking you to tell me where the calibration parameters are documented so I can fix it myself." Pause. Not for dramatic effect, I'm not that person, but because the answer to his question was the answer to everything, and I wanted to say it clearly. "They're not documented," I said. I requested a documentation analyst 4 times. The request was denied 4 times. The calibration parameters were in my personal files, which are my personal property. I'm sorry, Raj. Silence. The kind of silence that happens when someone understands something they wish they didn't. How bad is this going to get? He asked. That depends on how quickly someone figures out what I was actually doing every quarter. The Q4 rebalancing is the most urgent issue, but it's not the only one. Sentinel's forecasting model needs a manual input adjustment every January for fiscal year rollover. Nexus has 23 vendor contracts with renewal windows in Q4 that require proactive outreach. If those lapse, you lose negotiated pricing tiers and revert to standard rates, which will cost approximately $340,000 annually across the affected vendors. And Pratt Industrial's Q4 compliance audit is due November 15th, which requires a custom report format that I built manually because the standard Nexus output doesn't match their internal audit template. More silence. Raj, I said. I'm sorry. I genuinely am. But this is what happens when a company decides that one person's knowledge isn't worth $65,000 a year to document. The Pratt Industrial situation detonated on October 30th. I know the exact date because Diane texted me at 11:14 a.m. Sandra Yee just called Neil directly. She's not happy. Understatement of the century. Sandra Yee, Pratt's logistics director, the woman who did not tolerate excuses, had received the Q4 compliance package from Callaway and Mercer. It was late. It was in the wrong format. And it contained 3 data discrepancies that Sandra identified within 20 minutes of opening it, because Sandra Yee had been doing this for 25 years and could read a compliance report the way a mechanic listens to an engine. She knew what wrong sounded like before she knew what was wrong. Sandra put Pratt Industrial's account, $18.6 million annually, Callaway and Mercer's single largest client, on formal review. Formal review meant a 60-day evaluation period during which Pratt would assess whether Callaway and Mercer could demonstrate operational continuity consistent with contractual service standards. In practical terms, it meant that $18.6 million was now conditional, and the condition was, fix this or we leave. Ethan called me that afternoon. Not texted. Well, his voice had changed. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by something tighter, higher, the vocal equivalent of a man gripping a steering wheel too hard. Vivian, hey. So, we've got a situation with the Pratt account, and I think there might be some prior institutional context that would be really helpful for me to download from you so we can. Ethan, I don't work at Callaway and Mercer. I know, but this is. Sandra Yee is threatening to pull an $18 million account, and I don't. The compliance report, there's a format she wants that I can't find anywhere in the system, and that's because it's not in the system. I built that report format manually. It was part of my operational knowledge. Okay, so could you walk me through it? Just a quick call, maybe 30 minutes. No. Vivian. Ethan, you were promoted to Senior Director of Supply Chain Intelligence. The word, intelligence, is in your title. This is the job. He was quiet for a moment. I could hear him breathing. Somewhere in the background, a phone was ringing. The kind of ringing that happens in an office where multiple things are going wrong simultaneously and not enough people know how to fix any of them. What do you want? He asked. And there it was. The question underneath all the other questions. The question that people ask when they've run out of jargon and acronyms and whiteboard bullet points and are left standing in the empty space where competence was supposed to be. I want what I've always wanted, I said. To be valued accurately. You're about 8 months too late for that conversation. By the end of the second week, the damage had a shape. Diane sent me the numbers because Diane believed in transparency the way some people believe in gravity. Not as a choice, but as a condition of existing in a rational universe. The ironclad routing misalignment had cost $287,000 in excess carrier surcharges and late delivery penalties. 14 clients had filed formal service complaints. The Louisville warehouse was operating at 118% capacity because misrouted inventory was accumulating faster than it could be redirected. And Raj Patel was working 14-hour days trying to manually reroute shipments using a spreadsheet he'd built himself because he couldn't access the Tier 2 calibration logic, and Ethan's suggestion to just reset the algorithm had resulted in a system error that took Ironclad offline for 6 hours on October 22nd. Nexus had begun sending automated renewal notices to vendors whose contracts were entering Q4 windows, but the notices used default template language instead of the customized outreach I'd developed for each vendor relationship. Reinhardt Precision, the Akron fastener company I'd saved in 2020 with a $34 lunch, received a form letter addressed to valued supplier and responded by requesting a meeting to discuss the future of our partnership, which in vendor language means, "We're considering leaving and want you to give us a reason not to." Their contract represented $6.2 million annually. And Sentinel's forecasting model, without the January fiscal year adjustment that I'd performed every year since 2019, was beginning to drift. Not dramatically, not yet, but in the way that forecasting models drift when their inputs are slightly miscalibrated. The predictions were still plausible, still close enough to reality that nobody questioned them, but the gap between forecast and actual was widening by approximately 3% per week. By January, that gap would translate into either $1.8 million in excess inventory or $2.3 million in stockout losses, depending on which direction the drift went. I knew this because I'd modeled the failure scenario in 2020, when I was building the case for the documentation analyst. The model was on my personal laptop, in the folder, next to Caleb's drawings. Ethan called me 3 more times that week. I answered once, the third call on Friday, October 27th, because I wanted to hear what desperation sounded like when it was wearing a Patagonia vest. "Vivian, I need you to come back. I'll talk to Neil. We can restructure the reporting line. You'd report directly to Neil, not to me. Same title, Senior Director. I can probably get you to $140,000, maybe $145,000 with a retention bonus." Ethan. And I know the transition was handled badly, I get that, I totally get that, but we're in a critical operational window right now and the Pratt situation is. Ethan. Sandra Yee won't return my calls, Vivian. She won't return my calls. I've emailed her 4 times and she. Ethan. Stop. Stop. Sandra Yee won't return your calls because she doesn't know you. She knew me. She knew me because I spent 9 years building a relationship with her based on competence and reliability and the understanding that when she called at 2 a.m. with a problem, someone who understood her business would answer. You can't email your way into that. You can't sink your way into that. That relationship was built over years, and you don't have years. You have. I checked the calendar on my phone. 46 days until her formal review period ends. So what do? I don't know, Ethan. What does your operational roadmap say? He didn't answer. I could hear him breathing again. Somewhere distantly I heard a door close. Vivian, please. Good luck, I said. And I meant it. Not sarcastically, not cruelly. I meant it the way you mean it when you watch someone standing at the base of a mountain they're not equipped to climb, with genuine sympathy and absolutely no intention of carrying them. Before I tell you what happened next, how the Pratt situation resolved, what Neil Calloway did when the board got involved, and the conversation that changed everything, I want to ask you something. Have you ever trained someone who then leapfrogged you? Have you ever watched your own knowledge get repackaged as someone else's competence? If that's a story you recognize, make sure you're subscribed, because what happened in November is the part I've been waiting to tell you. And it's the part that made every missed weekend and every deferred raise and every ignored proposal worth the wait. 3 weeks after my departure, Calloway and Mercer was bleeding from places Ethan Langford didn't know the company had veins. The ironclad routing failure had metastasized. What started as a Q4 calibration miss had cascaded into a systemic misalignment across all 4 facilities because the routing parameters weren't independent. They were interdependent, weighted against each other in a balancing logic I'd refined over 7 years. And when Raj tried to manually correct the Indianapolis-Louisville issue without understanding the downstream dependencies, he inadvertently shifted the Pittsburgh allocation ratios, which triggered a capacity overflow in the Indianapolis warehouse, which caused the automated overflow protocol to reroute 340 orders to Louisville, which was already at 118% capacity and now hit 131%. Louisville's dock scheduling system, a third-party platform that interfaced with Ironclad through an API connection I'd configured personally in 2018, began rejecting inbound shipments because the system couldn't reconcile the volume against the dock calendar. Raj called me on November 3rd, Not to ask for help this time, but to tell me, in the flat voice of a man who has been awake for 30 hours, that Louisville had 212 shipments in queue with no dock assignments and an estimated $94,000 in daily demurrage charges accumulating against carriers who were sitting in the parking lot with nowhere to unload. Ethan held an all-hands meeting this morning, Raj said. He called it a recalibration summit. He stood in front of the warehouse team and said we needed to reimagine our throughput paradigm. Marcus, you remember Marcus, the night shift supervisor. Marcus asked him what that meant specifically in terms of which shipments to prioritize, and Ethan said, "Let's take that offline." In a warehouse, Vivian. He said, "Let's take that offline in a building that is, by definition, not online." I didn't laugh. I wanted to, but I didn't because Raj was exhausted and the situation wasn't funny. It was predictable, which is different from funny, though the Venn diagram has significant overlap. The same week, the Ohio Department of Commerce sent Callaway and Mercer a compliance inquiry regarding hazardous materials shipping documentation. This was something I need to explain because it's the part that Ethan never saw coming, the part that moved the situation from expensive to dangerous. Callaway and Mercer distributed hydraulic systems and industrial solvents, some of which were classified as hazardous materials under DOT regulations. The shipping documentation for these materials required specific handling codes, emergency contact protocols, and carrier certifications that I had maintained through a custom compliance module I'd built into Nexus in 2020. The module auto-generated the required documentation for every hazmat shipment, but it relied on a carrier certification database that I updated manually every 6 months, cross-referencing each carrier's DOT hazmat endorsement against the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration registry. The last update had been July 2023. The next update was due January 2024. Without it, the module would continue generating documentation using carrier certifications that might have lapsed, expired, or been revoked. And if a shipment moved under an invalid certification, the liability wasn't theoretical. It was federal. The Ohio Department of Commerce inquiry was routine, a standard audit triggered by volume thresholds. But it required Callaway and Mercer to produce current carrier certification records for all hazmat shipments in the previous 90 days. Ethan, who did not know the compliance module existed, who did not know the carrier certification database existed, who did not know that hazardous materials shipping documentation was anything other than a line item on a spreadsheet he'd never opened, forwarded the inquiry to Patricia Voss in legal with a note that said, and Diane read this to me verbatim because Diane believed I deserved to know. "Can you handle this? Seems like a routine compliance thing." Patricia Voss, who was a lawyer and not a supply chain specialist, looked at the inquiry, looked at the company's systems, and could not find the compliance module, because the compliance module's administrative interface was accessible through a Nexus pathway that was documented in my Tier 2 files. On my personal laptop, in the folder, Patricia called me on November 7th. She was professional, direct, and notably did not use the word synergy at any point in the conversation. "Vivian, I'm going to be straightforward with you. We've received a compliance inquiry from the Ohio Department of Commerce regarding hazmat shipping documentation. I've been unable to locate the compliance management system that apparently generates this documentation, and no one currently at the company appears to know how to access it or where the carrier certification records are maintained. I need to understand the scope of our exposure." "The compliance module is in Nexus," I said. "The administrative pathway is through the Vendor Management Dashboard under the Regulatory tab, which is a custom tab I added in 2020. It won't appear in the standard Nexus interface. You need to access it through a configuration menu that requires an admin-level login." "Do we have that login?" "You have the standard admin login. The Regulatory tab requires a secondary authentication that I set up through Nexus's Enterprise Security module. The credentials were in my operational files." "Your personal operational files?" "Yes." Silence. Patricia Voss was not a woman who wasted silence on drama. Her silence was computational. She was calculating exposure. "Vivian, what happens if we can't access the compliance module before the inquiry deadline?" "You'll need to manually reconstruct the hazmat shipping documentation for every qualifying shipment in the last 90 days. Based on typical Q3, Q4 volume, that's approximately 1,100 shipments. Each one requires carrier certification verification against the FMCSA registry, which takes about 15 minutes per shipment if you know what you're looking for. If you don't know what you're looking for, longer. That's 275 hours of work, at minimum. And the inquiry deadline is November 21st. 14 days. Yes, Vivian. Patricia's voice didn't change exactly, but it acquired a weight that hadn't been there before. Is there anything else I should know about? Other systems, other compliance obligations, other things that are going to surface in the next 30 days that we don't currently have access to. The Sentinel forecasting model needs a fiscal year adjustment in January. Without it, your Q1 inventory projections will be off by an estimated 12 to 18%, which translates to between $1.8 million and $2.3 million in either excess inventory or stockout losses. And you have 23 vendor contracts with Q4 renewal windows, 11 of which have already passed their proactive outreach deadlines. If those contracts lapse to default terms, you'll lose negotiated pricing tiers worth approximately $340,000 annually. I could hear Patricia writing. She wrote for a long time. Thank you, Vivian, she said. I may need to call you again. I'll answer, I said. 'Cause I would. I wasn't vindictive. I was gone, which is different. On November 9th, 2 days after Patricia's call, I received an email from Ethan Langford. Not a phone call this time. An email sent from his personal Gmail account rather than his company address, which told me that someone, probably Patricia, had advised him to be careful about what he put in writing on company systems. The email was 4 paragraphs long. The first paragraph accused me of deliberately withholding proprietary company information and engineering a situation designed to cause maximum operational disruption. The second paragraph referenced potential legal action for breach of fiduciary duty and misappropriation of institutional knowledge. The third paragraph demanded that I return all company-related documentation, files, and materials within 48 hours. The fourth paragraph said, I trusted you, Vivian. I thought we were building something together. I read the email twice. The first time for content. The second time for the particular flavor of irony contained in a man who had taken my job, my office, and my title telling me that he trusted me and thought we were building something together. It was the kind of irony that doesn't need commentary. It just sits there, fully formed, like a sculpture you can walk around and appreciate from every angle. I forwarded the email to Catherine Hale at Meridian Partners, who forwarded it to Meridian's general counsel, who responded within 2 hours with a letter to Ethan, copied to Neil Calloway and Patricia Voss, stating that my personal files were personal property, that no employment agreement or non-compete clause at Calloway and Mercer included provisions for post-employment knowledge transfer, that the company had been offered 4 opportunities to formalize the documentation in question and had declined each time, and that any further threats of legal action would be treated as harassment and responded to accordingly. Ethan did not email me again. But the damage was accelerating. Diane sent me updates not because I asked, but because Diane understood that I had a right to know the consequences of decisions I'd warned against for years. By November 15th, the cumulative financial impact looked like this. Carrier surcharges and demurrage from the ironclad routing failure. $743,000. Client service penalties across 14 accounts with SLA violations. $218,000. Emergency consulting fees for a third-party logistics firm Neil hired to help untangle the routing mess. $185,000. Pratt Industrial account. Still on formal review, $18.6 million at risk. Reinhardt Precision. Contract lapsed to default terms on November 1st, costing $340,000 annually in lost pricing tiers. And Reinhardt's owner, a man named Carl Reinhardt who had known me personally for 8 years, had begun conversations with a competitor. Hazmat compliance remediation. Neil authorized overtime for a 4-person team to manually reconstruct the shipping documentation at an estimated cost of $67,000 in labor. Sentinel forecasting drift. Not yet quantified but widening. Total confirmed losses and at-risk revenue as of November 15th. $20.153 million. For a company with $220 million in annual revenue, that was 9.2% of the top line. And the number was still growing. By week 5, the board got involved. Richard Mercer, Ethan's uncle, the co-founder, the man whose portrait hung in the lobby, called an emergency board meeting on November 20th. I know this because Diane told me, and because Raj told me, and because Sandra Yee at Pratt Industrial told me, which is how I learned that Sandra had been contacted directly by a board member named Helen Marsh. A different Helen Marsh than the one in the previous story. Though the universe does seem to produce Helen Marshes specifically for the purpose of holding boards accountable, who wanted to understand, from Pratt's perspective, what had gone wrong. Sandra told Helen what she'd told Neil, what she'd told Ethan, and what she'd told me. That Callaway and Mercer's operational competence had been concentrated in one person. That person had been replaced by someone who couldn't produce a compliant quarterly report. And Pratt Industrial was not in the business of maintaining $18.6 million relationships with companies that couldn't maintain their own infrastructure. The board meeting lasted 3 hours. I wasn't there, obviously. But I should mention Gerald. Gerald Maines was Callaway and Mercer's longest-serving board member, a retired operations executive who had been on the board for 11 years and who had, on 3 separate occasions, told Neil Callaway that the company's reliance on individual knowledge rather than institutional systems was a ticking time bomb. Gerald had voted against Ethan's appointment. He'd been overruled by Richard, who held a controlling interest. After the board meeting, Gerald called me. He got my number from Diane. "Vivian," he said. "I'm Gerald Maines. I don't think we've spoken before, but I've been reading your name in reports for a decade. I want you to know that what happened to you was wrong, and I said so in the meeting today. And I'm saying so to you now because I think you deserve to hear it from someone who was in the room." "Thank you, Gerald. What happened in the meeting?" Richard defended Ethan for about 40 minutes. Then Helen read the financial summary out loud. The full number, the $20 million. And the room got very quiet. Neil tried to frame it as a transition challenge. Helen asked him how many transitions he'd overseen that cost $20 million in 8 weeks. He didn't have an answer for that. What's the outcome? The board voted to place Ethan on administrative leave pending a full operational review. Richard abstained. Neil was instructed to retain an external consulting firm to assess the damage and develop a remediation plan. And Gerald paused. "The board asked me to contact you, informally, to ask whether you'd be willing to consult on the remediation. Paid, obviously, at whatever rate you set." I was standing in the kitchen of my new apartment in Chicago. I'd relocated for the Meridian position, a 2-bedroom in Lincoln Park that was smaller than our house in Columbus but had a window in the kitchen that faced east. And in the mornings the light came through in a way that made the room feel like it was being gently introduced to the day rather than assaulted by it. Caleb's drawings were on the refrigerator. James was in the living room reading. It was a Tuesday evening and I was home by 6:15, which was a thing that happened now, regularly, like a minor miracle I was still getting used to. "Gerald," I said, "I appreciate the call. And I appreciate the board's position. But I'm going to decline. Can I ask why?" "Because consulting on the remediation would mean rebuilding the systems I already built, for a company that replaced me with someone who couldn't maintain them, at a rate that would be higher than the salary they refused to give me when I was doing the work full-time. And while there's a certain symmetry to that, it's not the kind of symmetry I'm interested in. I'd rather build something new than rebuild something that was taken from me." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "That's the most dignified refusal I've ever heard." "It's not dignity, Gerald. It's math. My time is worth more at Meridian than it is cleaning up a mess I warned people about for 4 years. "Fair enough. For what it's worth, Vivian, and I know this doesn't fix anything, I'm going to recommend to the board that the company implement a formal knowledge management program. What happened to you should never have been possible." "It shouldn't have," I agreed. "But it was. And that's the part worth thinking about." Ethan called me one last time. November 22nd, the day before Thanksgiving. I was in the grocery store, standing in the baking aisle, trying to decide between two brands of pie crust because James's mother was coming for dinner, and she had opinions about pie crust that she expressed with the quiet intensity of a woman who had been making pies for 45 years and considered store-bought crust a moral failing. Vivian. His voice was different again. Not the confident voice from the first month. Not the tight, panicked voice from the Pratt crisis. Something flatter, emptier. The voice of someone who has run out of jargon and acronyms and whiteboard bullet points and is standing in the empty space where a career was supposed to be. Ethan. I'm on leave. You probably know that. I heard. My uncle is. He's not returning my calls. Neil told me the board is considering termination. Not leave. Termination. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you? I considered the question. I was holding a pie crust in each hand. One in a red box, one in a blue box. And a woman with a cart was trying to get past me in the aisle. And the fluorescent lights were buzzing the way they always buzz in grocery stores, at that frequency that exists just below conscious awareness but just above silence. Yes, I said. I am. Not because I think you were treated unfairly, you weren't. You were given a position you weren't qualified for. And the consequences were predictable and predicted. But I'm sorry because you were put in an impossible situation by people who should have known better, and you didn't have the experience to recognize it. Your uncle did you a disservice, Ethan. Promoting you wasn't a gift. It was a setup. Silence. Long enough that I put the red box in my cart and moved on to the next aisle. I didn't know, he said finally. About the systems. About how much. I didn't know what you were actually doing. I know you didn't. That was the problem. What do I do now? I don't know. But I'd start by learning the difference between a purchase order and a packing slip. It's more useful than you think. Hung up. I bought the pie crust. James's mother said it was acceptable, which from her was the equivalent of a standing ovation. The Monday after Thanksgiving, November 27th, the board convened again. This time the meeting was 2 hours, and the outcome was decisive. Ethan Langford was terminated. Not resigned. Terminated with cause, citing failure to maintain operational standards and material misrepresentation of qualifications during the appointment process. The material misrepresentation language was significant. It meant the board had concluded that Ethan's appointment had been based on Richard Mercer's advocacy rather than any objective assessment of Ethan's capabilities, and that this advocacy constituted a governance failure. Ethan received no severance. His separation agreement included a non-disparagement clause and a forfeiture of the $195,000 salary for the period of administrative leave, which the company clawed back as an overpayment against damages. Richard Mercer was asked to resign from the board. He refused. The board voted to strip his chairmanship and reduce his role to a non-voting advisory position, which is the corporate equivalent of being moved to a desk in the basement. Technically still employed, functionally irrelevant. Richard retained his equity stake but lost all operational authority. He stopped coming to the office in December. His portrait remained in the lobby, which I'm told created a specific kind of awkwardness that no one addressed because addressing it would require acknowledging what had happened, and acknowledging what had happened would require admitting that the portrait had been hanging next to a mission statement about excellence and integrity, while the man in the portrait was installing his nephew in a position that cost the company $20 million. Neil Callaway survived, barely. The board retained him as CEO on a probationary basis, contingent on implementing the operational reforms recommended by the external consulting firm, a firm called Whitfield Associates, which charged Callaway and Mercer $412,000 for a 90-day engagement that produced a 180-page report whose central recommendation was, essentially, document your institutional knowledge and don't promote people based on family relationships. $412,000 for advice I'd given for free 4 times. In 4 separate proposals that had been declined because the budget was tight. Sandra Yee pulled the Pratt Industrial account on December 15th. The formal review period ended, and Pratt's assessment was that Callaway and Mercer had failed to demonstrate the operational continuity required to maintain the partnership. $18.6 million. Sandra called me personally to tell me, Not because she needed to, but because she wanted me to know that her decision was based on the company's failures, not mine. "Vivian," she said, "if you ever need a reference, you call me. You're the reason we stayed as long as we did." Reinhardt Precision followed Pratt out the door in January, taking $6.2 million in annual supply volume to a competitor in Michigan. Carl Reinhardt sent me a Christmas card. Inside he'd written, "We miss working with you. The new people don't know what FOB means either." The total financial impact of Ethan Langford's 7 months as Senior Director of Supply Chain Intelligence, as calculated by Whitfield Associates in their final report. Direct operational losses, carrier surcharges, demurrage, SLA penalties $1.243 million. Client losses, Pratt Industrial, Reinhardt Precision, 2 smaller accounts $26.4 million in annual revenue. Compliance remediation, hazmat documentation, DOC inquiry response $284,000. External consulting and legal fees, $647,000. Sentinel forecasting drift, Q1 inventory misalignment $1.92 million in excess stock write-downs. Personnel costs, overtime, temporary staffing, Raj Patel's eventual resignation in February. He came to Meridian. I hired him $389,000. Total, $30.883 million. For a company with $220 million in annual revenue, that was 14% of the top line. Because a co-founder wanted his nephew to have a title, and a CEO didn't have the spine to say no, and a $65,000 documentation analyst position was too expensive. 14%. I think about that number sometimes. Not with satisfaction. Satisfaction would imply that I wanted this to happen, and I didn't. I wanted to be paid fairly and treated with respect and allowed to do the work I was good at. What I think about is the arithmetic of it. $65,000 to document the knowledge, or $30.883 million to learn why you should have. That's a 47,400% return on an investment they refused to make. If Ethan had put that on his whiteboard, it would have been the first accurate thing he'd ever written there. 18 months later, I was sitting in my office at Meridian Partners in Chicago, a corner office on the 14th floor, which I mention not because corner offices matter but because this one had 2 windows, and on clear days I could see the lake. And there is something about water visible from a place of work that recalibrates your understanding of what a career is supposed to feel like. My title was Vice President of Supply Chain Strategy. My salary was $214,000, with a performance bonus that had paid out at 28% the previous year, $59,920, and an equity participation agreement that would vest in 6 months. Catherine Hale, Meridian's managing director, had built the role specifically around my capabilities, which was a sentence I'd never been able to say before and which I still found slightly disorienting, like wearing shoes that fit after years of shoes that were close enough. I brought Raj with me. He was Meridian's director of warehouse operations, earning $142,000. $31,000 more than Callaway and Mercer had paid him for working 14-hour days during the crisis. He'd moved his family to Evanston. His daughter had started at a new school and already made the soccer team, which Raj told me about with a specific pride of a father who has finally stopped being too tired to attend games. Diane Okafor was still at Callaway and Mercer. She'd been promoted to COO in the restructuring, a role that should have existed years earlier and that Diane filled with the methodical competence of someone who had watched incompetence up close and developed a permanent allergy to it. She implemented the knowledge management program that Gerald Maines had recommended. She hired 2 documentation analysts. She created a formal succession planning protocol that required any leadership appointment to be vetted by an independent committee, rather than approved by a single board member with a family interest. She called me once a month on the first Tuesday to catch up. We talked about work and kids and the Thai place on High Street, which had closed in March, a loss we both mourned with disproportionate sincerity. Callaway and Mercer's revenue had stabilized at $187 million, down from $220 million, a 15% contraction that the Whitfield report attributed directly to the operational disruption and client losses during Ethan's tenure. They were recovering, slowly, the way companies recover when the damage is structural rather than superficial. Not by growing back to what they were, but by growing into something slightly different, slightly smaller, and hopefully slightly wiser. Ethan Langford was working at a SaaS startup in Raleigh. His LinkedIn said he was head of strategic partnerships, which, based on the company's size, 12 employees, series of funding, no visible revenue, probably meant he was doing business development calls and attending networking events. His profile still listed his MBA prominently. He had not listed Callaway and Mercer in his experience section. I noticed this not because I checked regularly, but because Raj checked regularly and reported back with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had spent 30 hours untangling a routing catastrophe caused by someone who thought recalibrate the fulfillment matrix was an actionable instruction. Richard Mercer sold his equity stake in Callaway and Mercer in August, 8 months after losing his chairmanship. The buyout was negotiated by Patricia Voss and valued at $14.2 million. Significantly less than the $19 million independent valuation from 2022, because the company was worth less now, because his nephew had made it worth less, which is the kind of poetic consequence that doesn't need embellishment. Richard moved to Scottsdale. I don't know what he does there. I don't think about it. Neil Callaway kept his job. He sent me a LinkedIn message in April that said, "Vivian, I hope you're doing well. I want you to know that I've learned a great deal from the past year, and I wish you nothing but success." I read it. I did not respond. Not out of anger. I wasn't angry, hadn't been angry in months, maybe longer, but because there was nothing to say. Neil had learned a $30 million lesson that I'd offered to teach him for $65,000. And the appropriate response to that wasn't a LinkedIn message. It was a documentation analyst and a succession plan and a company that would never again confuse a last name with a qualification. Diane told me he'd done all three. That was enough. Caleb turned 10 in June. I was there. Not for the quiet family dinner the next day. For the real party, the one with his friends, the one with the noise and the cake and the specific chaos of 10-year-olds in a backyard. James grilled burgers. Caleb's friend knocked a glass of lemonade onto my laptop, which was sitting on the patio table because I'd been reviewing a client proposal before the party started. And I closed the laptop and wiped it off and didn't open it again until Monday. The lemonade left a faint sticky residue on the trackpad that I never fully cleaned off. Still there. I don't mind it. It reminds me of something I'm still learning to prioritize. James stopped asking, "Should I save you a plate?" He started asking, "What time will you be home?" Which is the same question wearing different clothes, but the clothes tell you everything about the trajectory of the conversation. I was usually home by 6:30, sometimes 6:15. Once, on a Wednesday in September, I left the office at 4:45 because the lake was doing something extraordinary with the afternoon light and I wanted to see it from the ground, not from the 14th floor. Catherine Hale saw me leaving and said, "Early day," and I said, "Yes," and she said, "Good." And that was the entire conversation, which is what it sounds like when a company understands that the person who builds the systems is also a person. Here's what I know, and it's not a lesson about revenge because this was never revenge. Revenge requires anger, and I was never angry. I was clear. There's a difference. Anger is what you feel when something unexpected happens. Clarity is what you feel when something you predicted happens exactly the way you predicted it, and you've already moved on. I trained my replacement. They made him my boss. And then the systems I built did what systems do when the person who understands them is replaced by someone who doesn't. They told the truth. Not dramatically, not vindicatively, not on my schedule or anyone else's. They just stopped working the way they were supposed to because the knowledge that made them work had walked out the door in a cardboard box on October 6th. And no amount of synergizing the throughput paradigm was going to bring it back. If you've ever poured years into a role only to watch someone with the right connections leapfrog everything you built, if you've ever trained the person who replaced you and then been told to report to them, I hope this shows that your knowledge is your leverage, and the companies that refuse to value it will eventually pay the price of that refusal. I share workplace strategies and corporate analysis every week that help you navigate the gap between what you're worth and what you're paid. Like and subscribe if you found value here. Remember, they can promote whoever they want. They can give anyone a title, but they can't promote what you know into someone else's head. And when the systems start failing, they won't call the person with the title. They'll call the person who built it. Make sure your phone is already ringing somewhere better.